Hi there.
impressive, or the graphics. I feel like it's allowed people to coexist.
I'm Mike Witmore. I have the misfortune of following Vint. But I was lucky that he did have a few words to say, because what I am going to talk about today is the work that I'm doing with Vint on a project that he's called Digital Vellum. So most of what we know from the past is preserved. If it's not a cuneiform tablet, it's probably an animal skin, or it's very durable paper. That's why we actually have the plays of Shakespeare, because they were printed on rag paper, and those 400- and 500-year-old documents are very, very durable. So Vint has already explained the problem of the Dark Ages. Just a little bit of background. My background is in rhetoric. I used to be an English professor, and then I was director of the Folger Shakespeare Library for 13 years. It contains, among other things, about 400,000 physical books and manuscripts, many of them unique. And there is an old Apple II computer down in the basement to run some old Shakespeare games, but for the most part it's a physical archive. But it is expressed in 100,000 very high quality digital images. And then we took our best-selling version of Shakespeare's plays and made the text available for free. And that's a highly encoded text, which we're going to store on the blockchain so that it's interpreted far into the future. But the number one use case for that Shakespeare resource is PDF download. It tells you something about what people want to do with text. Okay, I'm going to talk primarily today about an ecosystem, because the problem of preservation, access, and interpretation is rich and multi-leveled. It's going to require multiple types of expertise. It has legal dimensions. It's constrained by business models, as Vint said. And there are many kinds of expertise that are relevant to this project of taking and transmitting cultural information, say, 1,000 years into the future. That's about the scale that we should be thinking on, although it's kind of also like a relay race. If you can preserve material for 100 years, the technology will get better and pick it up and send it forward. So my conviction here is that there's a role for the public, and I'll say more about that. There's also a range of folks from the humanities who have thought about the problem of retrieving and interpreting the past. So it's a piece of expertise that I hope I can share. Here's my best guess at what the ecosystem looks like. So we'll start at the bottom. Bits are potentially stable and storable with up to the right medium, and that is a technical problem and a hardware problem. It's one that I can't help with, but it's certainly something that may be the easiest piece to get right. As you move up, it gets harder. So hardware is, of course, subject to rapid and almost deliberate obsolescence with the redesign of products that break. And so the wonderful 80 Max there in Dini's museum is one way to fight back. We'll also be needing emulations. Software. The source and object codes can be locked up as intellectual property. So if Google creates a series of simulations that lets us read WordPerfect files, we can't boot the simulation because we're violating copyright. And that is a whole range of intellectual property issues that will be very difficult to penetrate, and creating the political will to change it is going to require sustained lobbying. Objects. We can choose what we save if we actually save it, and there are file formats that have different features and affordances. We're at a text conference, so I'm going to talk about text, but it's important to differentiate between the types of objects that are going to be saved, whether intentionally or accidentally. And finally, at the top, knowledge. This is the way in which objects are rendered useful for cognition, memory, and creation. That's the most difficult problem. That's the part where we want to talk to artists, to historians, to technologists. And just to differentiate between the two layers here, I think the bottom three present problems of preservation and continuity. I think the top two present problems of selection and use. I want to focus on the top. So, first starting with the object layer. This is not news to you, but by simply preserving sequence in some formatting, we get a lot of information for not so much carrying expense. Language is a terrific test case for preservation and backward compatibility. If you think about the history of classical languages, some of which we lost the grammar for, which had to be reconstructed by building dictionaries, by comparing surviving documents, it is possible to do that. And so there's something very powerful about human languages that allows them to be inferred backwards. Second, it's just a sad fact that the world creates 3 to 4 exabytes of information daily, and that number doubles every 2 to 3 years. Texts are pretty efficient, 1 to 1.5 bits per character, as opposed to 24 bits for a pixel in full color. There's something compact about text. So while text is parsimonious and information rich, it is also context hungry. And that's something I would like to expand on. There's been some terrific conversation today about how the low dimensionality of the web makes it harder for us to marshal context, which is what allows us to interpret documents in a rich and flexible way. I want to give you an example. When Shakespeare died in 1616, he did have a will. The will was read, and the will bequeathed to his wife his second best bed. This has been interpreted a lot because there's only really 9 documentary facts about Shakespeare's life that are directly connected to him, and his will is one of them. So on the one hand, you could look at that single instance of the document and say, boy, he really must not have liked his wife because he gave her this crappy bed. But if you talk to someone who's looked at thousands of wills and knows the marriage laws, they'll say, oh no, Anne Hathaway was entitled to a significant amount of his property simply by being married to him. That all conveyed to her. This was an add-on in the will, and in a household, the best bed was reserved for the guests. The second best bed was the marriage bed. So it's actually the opposite interpretation. This was an intimate act of bequest. And the only reason we can interpret it that way is because we have hundreds of wills that have survived. Adjacency is so important in language because it is a high context sensitive phenomenon. And when you're talking about preserving the past, your dream is to not just get one document, but a whole trove of documents, which are somewhat related. But then you also want to find documents that have nothing to do with those documents, because you might find something unexpected in that other set. So it's great that text is parsimonious, but you have to have a lot of it, because that's how interpretation works. Let's go last to the knowledge layer. You may have heard of the philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. He was a semiotician. He divided all signs into 3 types. There's the symbolic, the iconic, and the indexical. It's still a useful distinction. So interesting thing about text is that it is both indexical and symbolic. It is an index that is a physical trace of someone with an intention to leave a mark behind, just like smoke is an index of fire, but it's also symbolic. It is intended to mean something other than it is. And there's a whole set of conventions that allow us to recognize it as language-like, and then to parse it along conventions that make it intelligible communally. So if you want to compare documents in the original context, you're going to want to have these adjacent texts, and second best bed is a good example. But you also want to preserve the continuous history of interpretation of a given text so that you can understand its meaning. New Testament Greek contains a word ecclesia, which refers to the church. If you're a Catholic theologian in the Middle Ages, that means the visible church in all of its hierarchy. If you're a Reformation theologian like Luther or Calvin, you mean the spiritual gathering of like-minded individuals. And difference in interpretation of that one word is responsible for thousands of deaths in the 16th and 17th century. It really does matter, not just what the original intention was for creating a word, but the history of how people have interpreted it. So you don't just want one instance, you want a timeline, a through line of instances of a word. What we've learned from the history of text as a medium, and this is a point I'd like to make very strongly, is the decision to preserve something is itself information rich. 18 of Shakespeare's plays would be lost today if we didn't have a book called The First Folio, printed in 1623, created by two friends of Shakespeare who acted with him. He's dead, and they say, we want to preserve 36 plays, and we're going to provide some terrific metadata. We're going to introduce it. We'll provide a picture of Shakespeare. We'll divide them up into types of plays. That is very different from discovering a random letter in a drawer somewhere and interpreting it hundreds of years later. But like Hemmings and Condell, who created the First Folio, we too may want to identify items that we think deserve to be saved. And a historian wants to know that we wanted to save it. So that's the last piece of context that I think we need to be sensitive to when we think of text. We do have the ability to choose. We must choose because there's too much data to preserve. I think text is a great bet. Thank you.
Questions, comments, poetry? Ken?
Yes.
Have you thought about how to represent some of those relationships between these different objects? And it's a whole other, because there's the objects, but then there's the relationships, and so how do you represent those?
Yeah. Well, there is a physical tradition of interrelating objects. I was talking about Leibniz and the decision of how he was going to structure the Wolfenbüttel library. So bibliography and references and the whole humanistic tradition of footnotes is a way of stating relations between entities. It's clearly very useful, and there's a lot of information there, but there are many, many more possible ones. So the universe of metadata that we inhabit now, including crowdsourced metadata, I think is probably, in the end, richer than leaving it to, I worked in a library, but if you just leave it to librarians and the subject heading catalog of the Library of Congress, you will not have a rich ontology of the phenomena that you want to describe. Yes?
Quick question that I hope is not going to be too provocative. This
You're very provoking. I've seen it.
can't be worse than this. So it's the future of text. Here I hear the past of text. I'm a little bit egocentric. I think how can, for example, when I define a format, let's say layout, or give an affordance to it, how can I make it kind of future-proof? That it will make you, if imagining it is useful, interesting, I can make your job easier. So do you have like
I do.
Okay.
Keep it simple.
Good question. Yeah.
Keep it simple.
Yeah.
Because someone 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, the cuneiform tablets, which came with no instruction manual for how to read them, it was a compact, limited character set that could be parsed over and over again until someone figured out how to interpret it. But simple is best.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Also,